carols this afternoon. So, moving on to a new window now. The window up on the, let me get this right, south side above the door, the other door into the community centre. Notable for all saints in this window being women, the only such window rather in the church, and I thought I'd speak a little bit about Mary and Martha, who I've done a little bit of research on during my degree for the last couple of years, so they're saints who are in a certain way quite dear to me and dear to my thinking. And because, there requires a slightly different approach to the kind of thing that Margaret did with us last week. We're dealing here with biblical saints rather than sort of mid-church history saints. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the biblical record of them and how that's represented in the windows, and also a bit about the reception of Mary and Martha within the history of Christian spirituality, which speaks to some of the way in which they're represented as well. Part of the question, on the title I put at the top of the handout, on this side with all the pictures, is what to call them. Because that's half the story, really. They're named in the scrolls around their heads in the window as St. Mary of Bethany, Santa Maria de Betania, and St. Martha, Host of Christ. Not a title I've actually heard before, but it's interesting to see that as a pairing for their names. I've also put in brackets Companions of Our Lord, which is alongside Lazarus, their brother, is the name that's given to them in the lectionary. Mary and Martha are quite interesting cases in terms of how the church commemorates saints and keeps festivals for saints, in that they are most of the other biblical characters who encountered Jesus, we know of as members of the very first generation of the church, are kept as red letter days by the Church of England. They have their own feasts and collects within the Book of Common Prayer, and that's true of the apostles, the evangelists, figures like Stephen, John the Baptist, Mary Magdalene. When you cut those figures out, there aren't that many named figures in the New Testament who aren't quite at that status, and actually you have Mary and Martha who get lesser festivals in our tradition. Interestingly, if you are looking for other figures in the New Testament who are sort of in that kind of B-team level, the other place you might look for is Timothy and Titus, who are listed as companions of St. Paul, who are the flanking windows down here on this side of the church. I'm not sure if that's any kind of conscious decision, but it's interesting that we have a certain kind of space in the church in two places for these kind of saints who are figured as companions. So the church sort of works out what to do with saints who aren't figured as apostles, evangelists, companions, sort of minor figures, but minor figures who are mentioned twice in two of the Gospels, in two quite different traditions, in two quite different ways. The story of the raising of Lazarus, which is only told in John's Gospel, and Lazarus is interestingly absent from this window, and the story of Mary and Martha welcoming Jesus to their home in Luke's Gospel, in Luke 10, which is the one which seems to be the focus here, and which is the one which I'll talk about most. Just to dwell a little bit more with some details on the window, and things I'd not noticed before, and things that got me thinking about these characters in a new way. Mary on the left, I've never seen before representation of Mary of Bethany reading with a book, and this is clearly modelling on the prophets in the Great Window, the Great West Window, in which the prophets have sort of lines from the Old Testament predicting the virgin birth and the coming of Christ. Mary is carrying it's a Latin text from the Vulgate. It's from the end of Psalm 16, and it translates as, "In your presence there is fullness of joy." It's interesting to think about. I've never seen that connection with Mary at all. I don't quite know whether there is a particular link between Mary and that psalm within the Church Fathers or with any ancient writing of the Church. In your presence there is fullness of joy is, I think, clearly meant to be the idea that Mary, who chooses to sit at the feet of Jesus, is the person who is associated with coming into his presence, seeking delight in his presence. there are lots of places you could turn into the Bible for a theme like that, so the question is always, why this psalm? And one thing that it can be quite interesting to do if you're looking at a single verse from the psalm in a window is think about, it assumes that the person seeing it might know the rest of the psalm as well. And so there might be other material in the whole psalm. You're invited to reflect on the whole thing in relation to this person. Earlier in Psalm 16 and verse 5, there is the line, "The Lord is my chosen portion." And that language of Mary choosing the better part, choosing, the distinctive thing is her choosing Christ. That is mentioned in the psalm as well. The other possible thing is those final lines, "In your presence there is fullness of joy," are linked to, the psalmist is confident they will not see the pit. They will not see, they will not go into death. And this is a psalm which is taken even in the New Testament as a psalm about the resurrection of the dead. So it's interesting that this psalm is used, and somewhere in the background here, maybe there is Lazarus and confidence in the resurrection of the dead, because that's something that this psalm is talking about as well. These are just ideas. I'm sort of shooting from the hip here, but it's something else I've never seen this verse associated with that saint before, and it got me thinking. Representation of Martha on the right with her spindle and distaff, her spinning thread. That seems to be drawing on Proverbs 31 and that praise of the praise for a good woman, of a good wife, which specifically associates women with weaving, and that's why the distaff becomes a symbol for a certain kind of women's work, and that seems to be why she's presented with her here. More on that in a minute, but it's very clear we're getting two different kind of representations of work together here on either side of the window. As I say, the window seems to be drawing most of its attention to the Lucan narrative. It's not a parable, but it's often taken up as a parable of Mary and Martha welcoming Jesus into their home, which interestingly is never located in Luke's Gospel. The idea that they live in Bethany is something which is made clear by John. Luke's Gospel is structured as a single narrative of Jesus moving from Galilee towards Jerusalem. If it's happening as it says it is, Jesus should be nowhere near Bethany, which is right outside Jerusalem at this point. He's in Galilee in Nain. So exactly where Mary and Martha are living at this point, if they're historical characters, is actually an interestingly open question. But that's what we're focusing on here. And of course, this is a story which gets taken up substantially in the Christian tradition as ways to think about what does it mean to serve Christ? What kind of life should we lead as a way of welcoming Jesus into our hearts? An interesting thing to think about as we prepare for Christmas. It's a real shame Joan isn't here this morning. I know she's been incredibly busy with difficult things over the last few weeks, but Joan openly moaned to me about saying how much she hates this story. So I'm really sad she isn't here today for me to have a bit of a sparring partner dialogue going on with her. But hopefully she'll watch the recording when she has a chance. But it is a difficult one, and I think now we're mainly going over the sheet. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way the story's been taken up. There is a history of simply reading Jesus' words to Martha. Martha, why are you so worried? Why are you so distracted? Mary has chosen the better part. Mary has chosen the right thing to do, quite simply, in sitting and listening to Jesus. One can take that on face value, and that has been an established Christian reading for some time. I mean, that does rather neatly allegorise the two sisters, thinks of them as two particular ways of living. At the top of the handout, I've put some reasons why that binary does become quite taken up and does become quite significant in the ways that the story's been interpreted. One is that early Christianity in the Mediterranean, when it starts to spread, when Christianity starts to become a persuadable religion within the Mediterranean, it starts to get influenced and shaped by Greek philosophy and by forms of Platonism, Platonism makes a distinction between what's sometimes in Greek called the bios pratikos, the active life, and the bios theoretikos, the life of seeing, the life of contemplating, the life of just sitting there and absorbing, as Mary absorbs Jesus' teaching. So we get those two things, and according to Platonic religion, effectively, the divine, the good, is all theory. It's all soul. The idea is everything that we do that is active, that is busy, will ultimately get purged away. Platonism is quite dualistic like that. Really does prize the life of the soul over the life of the body. This informs, in some ways, the way that early Christian mystics start to think about the Christian life. Origen of Alexandria is one of the first Christian theologians not in the Bible. As he lives in Alexandria, which is at that time one of the great centres of Greek learning in the north of Egypt. And he develops this idea that actually the path to becoming a mystic, the path to growing in the Christian faith, is to move from ascesis, which is moral action, doing work in the world, to illumination, to seeing things, taking things on, recognising God, being in the presence of God, and then going from there to union, the idea that one can become united with God, one can enter fully into the presence such that there's no distinction between your soul and the presence of God, but one moves through. And according to this allegory, you would move from Martha to Mary into the fullness of the divine life. The other sort of set of ideas which encourage a kind of quite hard prizing of Mary over Martha comes in the Reformation when this story is read in the light of the Lutheran doctrine of salvation by faith, not by works. The one thing that Mary has is believed to be faith in Christ. And therefore she is set very clearly over Martha. I think I'll be okay. Yeah, I'll be okay now. Yeah. So these are dominant ideas at work within aspects of the Christian tradition, but they never quite land. There are things, whenever one tries to map ideas onto the Gospels, which are seen as a historical narrative, a narrative about real people, real figures in the early church, it doesn't quite stick. And I put this in section B on the handout. John's Gospel says, Jesus loved Martha and her sister Mary and Lazarus. You see, I think most people read into that exchange a great degree of affection, a gentle teasing, a sense that actually there is something right about what Martha is doing nonetheless. It's also important to recognise that within apocryphal traditions of both the early church and the medieval church, other stories are told about Mary and Martha and Lazarus. If we assume they're living in Bethany, which is right outside Jerusalem, as the church starts to grow, the church in Jerusalem is persecuted, and there are stories about them fleeing away. In some Eastern traditions, they end up in Cyprus, and Lazarus becomes the first bishop of Cyprus. In medieval tradition, which is much more fanciful and the kind of thing we heard with Margaret last week, they end up in Marseille. And in the Golden Legend, some of the great medieval stories, there are stories of things like Martha taming dragons and things like that and converting people. But basically what I'm trying to say here is there's a strong understanding that all three of them are involved in the life of the early church. They are all believed for Christians for many centuries to be doing missionary work. So action as such never goes away. The other sting in the tail is in the Western church, particularly after Gregory the Great preaches in, I think, the 6th century, Mary of Bethany, the Mary of Luke's parable, starts to get conflated with various other characters. She gets conflated with an earlier unnamed figure in Luke's Gospel who anoints Jesus. I've forgotten it. In different Gospels, either his head or his feet. The conflation happens because in John's Gospel, it is the same Mary who is the sister of Martha and Lazarus who does that just before Jesus is crucified. In Luke's Gospel, that happens much earlier. It happens with an unnamed woman. And so people think, oh yes, that woman is Mary of Bethany. She then sort of gets entangled with Mary Magdalene as well, and there is this sense that Mary, before she became the kind of person who would sit at Jesus' feet, was a fallen woman who repented and changed her ways. So therefore, there's a slight hint of ambiguity there. There's a hint that Martha, as the older sister, the sister who owns the house, might be somebody who is leading Mary out in the faith. I mentioned on the handout, there's a Caravaggio picture of Martha and Mary Magdalene, with Martha sort of pointing Mary away from mirrors and vanity. So there's always been a slight ambiguity about whether one is simply to be prized above the other. And then what we see as things develop in the church, we start to see more developing readings of the two alongside each other, of action and contemplation as two harmonious ways of living. That these two sisters need each other, that these two modes of serving Jesus work alongside each other. As monasticism starts to emerge in various contexts, a way of living out Christian faith and Christian witness, we start to repeatedly recognise that actually this business of doing the dishes, is actually really important. There are, in the collections of stories of Desert Fathers we hear, there's stories of monks saying, fine, if you want to go and just sit and play by yourself, we'll lock you away, you just do that. Actually, we need people to look after us as well. When St. Francis starts developing hermitages for his brothers in the Middle Ages, his instructions say that rather than simply going off by themselves, brothers should go in pairs, and that one should be Mary for the other's Martha over periods of weeks. They should take it in turns to serve each other while the other rests and prays and contemplates. And as these communities grow, they recognise that both are needed, and there is a risk that people can fall into one identity or the others, often along lines of social class, along lines of level of education. You get the sense there are, wealthier or more educated nuns, largely, who are the ones who can sit and pray, and others work for them. And increasingly, those who are running communities realise a need to challenge this and change this and find an alternative story about how we work together and live together in community. There's a tradition in the Middle Ages, abbesses and mothers superior start to be given the name Martha. Martha is appended to their titles sometimes as a mark of that is their particular duty, a duty of service and organisation for those whose duty is to be set aside to pray to God. And this continues right through the Middle Ages. It continues through the Counter-Reformation as well, who people are cutting against the idea of faith over works quite as tightly as Luther is. And I mentioned here, this is in section C, towards the bottom of section C, I mentioned Teresa of Avila. Her great mystical work, The Interior Castle, which she writes for her sisters, for nuns in her Carmelite order, that actually, it's a story a bit like what I said about Oregon, that gradual growth from you start working, you start doing your moral discipline in the world, you gradually become more illuminated, you eventually come to union with Christ. The Interior Castle is structured as such a journey, but at the very heart, at the very end of that book, the end of the multiple layers of interiors into the castle of the soul, at the heart is Mary and Martha together. At the heart is mutual service. And actually, a little interesting thing to note here, Teresa of Avila calls her book The Interior Castle. The castle becomes metaphor for the soul that prays, that protects itself, that guards itself. In the Vulgate Bible, the term that is used for village, the village that Jesus passes into where Mary and Martha welcome him, is castellum. And if you look, I'm also intrigued that at the very bottom of the windows, we have Mary and Martha sitting in their sepulchral crenellations, in their separate little castles. So there's something here being thought about Mary and Martha being different ways of thinking about how our souls prepare themselves for Jesus through prayer and reflection and through action as well. And I just at the bottom of section C there, I talk a bit about the 19th century context in which this window was made. One thing we see in that context in the Anglican Communion is a revival of monasticism. We see, particularly among women, we see communities of religious sisters beginning to form. And I'm waiting to hear more with the Holland family next week, but certainly they are associates of figures like Charles Gore, who founds the Community of the Resurrection, and there is this revival of interest in how we can build new kinds of monastic community. So that these questions started to become important again. We're also seeing in the 19th century an increasingly distinctive role for lay women. It's increasingly becoming common that religion is entering the private sphere. What you do at home to cultivate the religious life is becoming much more important. There's an increasing sense that it is the role of women to raise families and children in the faith, sometimes to go to church on behalf of the family. One reason that we start to see numbers of church attendance starts to drop in the 19th century is because there's an idea of a kind of surrogacy, that some people will go on to church on behalf of others. So increasingly, we're seeing it's the work of women and children to balance domestic work and piety. So I'm interested that we have an image of Mary and Martha as two people equally celebrated, equally with halos around their heads, with their own windows, holding these two things together. I'm also interested in the fact that, again, we see Mary reading, and actually in the bottom of the window, it's interesting that Mary is not actually sitting at Jesus' feet. She's sitting at a pre-diurnal prayer desk, praying with a book. That's a much more common representation of the Virgin Mary than it is of Mary of Bethany. But it's interesting that there's a kind of mental translation going on. Listening to Jesus is actually reading about him, rather than giving an accurate representation of the biblical parable. We're seeing what would a person like Mary be doing today. She'd be reading, she'd be studying. Martha would be the person fetching in the food and drink. And actually, in practice, for lots of people, those are actually two sides of themselves. The time that they're sitting with a book, the time they're going out and serving people, those two things work together. It's not particularly clear either in this photo or actually in the window itself, but by my reckoning, what you have there is Mary in blue and Martha in red. Blue, the colour associated with divinity, with direct contemplation, with deep thoughts about God. Red, the colour of sacrifice, of blood, of going out and doing things, but also the colour of the Holy Spirit and energy and active work in the world. So they're being mapped onto those two colours there. There's a real attempt to see both of them together, and that becomes, certainly by the 19th century, becoming out of this long monastic tradition, the kind of dominant reading. The question that nags for some people is that, Mary is still given the better part. What of Martha? Can Martha yet have her day? And there is a third tradition, which I'll just close by drawing out a little bit more, which I don't think is the one this window is particularly drawing on, but I think is there and live as well, of Martha actually being the one who Jesus is praising here. This, and it runs through the tradition, and it runs all the way into the past. Meister Eckhart, really interesting theologian from the 13th century, he ended up in Strasbourg. He was a Dominican friar who preached to Beguines, who are women who were in some respect like nuns but weren't cloistered. They lived active lives of service within the burgeoning merchant cities of Europe. And they were actively involved in the world, and they were sometimes viewed with some suspicion for, not being quite so cloistered and quite so well behaved, but actually being active and being engaged as citizens. And Meister Eckhart actually says that Mary is the one who is still naive. Mary is the one sitting at Jesus' feet. She is longing for the sweetness and consolation of God. He says she is longing for her soul's satisfaction. Martha is the person who sees where Mary has to go. Mary isn't actually the one further along this mystical stage of union. She hasn't started yet. She needs to get ready to do works, to go out and do the kinds of things that Martha is doing. And, you know, what she's got there, sitting listening to Jesus, is the foundation, the one basic thing. And then you deepen and deepen and deepen after that. What's wrong with Martha is she's worried about multiple things, she's caught up in a multiplicity of action, but actually there is a way of holding all of those actions in a state of contemplation, which is what she's growing into and what she's being encouraged to deepen into as she goes along. And actually it is interesting that the term that is used in the Greek by Martha for her many tasks, it's not actually a word which has anything to do with food and drink. All the representations show Martha like preparing a meal, even in this window. The term is diaconia, which is a very general term for ministry, really. It's the term for deacon, which is where my job this year comes from. And there are debates about this, but diaconia does not necessarily just mean menial tasks, the washing up. It can mean any task you do on behalf of another. It can mean being sent out to be a servant and to do certain kinds of things. So it's a bit of a stretch, and I think most scholars wouldn't say this, but is Martha seen as a deacon? Is Martha someone who actually had a leading role in the early life of discipleship of the church? If people believe that she goes out and does start to lead the church, is she somebody who is actively engaged in leading and needs to be reminded of what was it like when he started? What was it like when he had that first engagement with the presence of Jesus? And I'll end with this. I'm meant to bring it along, and I can photocopy it for those who want to know. I mean, another reason I'm interested in talking about Mary and Martha is where I trained at Cuddesdon for the last 3 years, in the village church there. There's another window of Mary and Martha there, of the same vintage, another 19th century window. And I read a really interesting article about it in the Church Times a couple of years ago by that church's former vicar, Emma Pennington. The interesting thing she noted there is it looks like a window like this in that standard Victorian model, two ways of serving. Martha has a brilliantly disgruntled look on her face, sort of peering out the window in that window. But in that one, it has Jesus as well, and Jesus is blue and red together. His vestments combine the two colours. And in that one, it's Mary who's in red and Martha who's in blue. And there's an inversion. And there's a sense that actually, maybe what we think of as action can be contemplative, and what is contemplative can be action. Maybe, once we're all living in community and working together, the way we value those two different things can alternate, and we can see something of one in the other. So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you for listening to me for so long.
Anyone want to ask any questions? I think a very good representation of Mary and Martha is the Society of Mary and Martha, which principally is to support clergy, but it's a wonderful place where service and contemplation live side by side. The same people are doing the same thing.
Thank you. I did a placement with them actually in my first summer training. I went down and lived with them for 3 weeks. It's a wonderful place.
Stayed for 1 year.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah. But that's a really fantastic. But as Sue just said, they do a lot of work with clergy and ministerial burnout and stress, and this idea that actually you need time to rest, and actually that is the most important thing, and that is the one thing. That's why that story does become quite powerful for people. Thank you for saying that.
And when we were there, the chap who was masterminding the kitchen was actually a priest who actually put the services as well. So he was doing both.
I think you're right that Kemp always was very clear about showing Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the Pedia. And I think it was a conscious decision to show Mary of Bethany in that way.
Yeah.
But I think the important the other important thing to remember about this window, it was done in memory of a woman, and clearly a highly respected woman, and a woman who had resources of her own, because as you will hear next week. So it's, I think, is probably reflecting her understanding of what a woman's role would be, and the fact that both are included in both Mary and the Martha are included in the vocation of being a woman.
Yeah.
Can I just say, next week I will be speaking briefly on St Dorothy and then on the role of the Hollands in our church. It's going to be in the church because that's where what I'm talking about. But it's only going to be for 15 minutes tops because the choir are rehearsing, and Kevin agreed to delay the choir rehearsal by 15 minutes, and I promise that it won't be any longer. So it will not cover as much as one could cover about the Hollands, and there is plenty more to say. It will focus basically just on what they did in terms of fabric for the church. So be prepared that I think I will come into the here afterwards, and if anyone wants to prolong the discussion, ask the question, they can do that here, but well away from the choir rehearsal. But it does mean I will start talking at 11:30 on the dot, because I have promised to stop talking at 11:45 on the dot. So if you want to hear it, you need to go into the church and be ready.